Hello everyone and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. On April the 30th, the American writer Paul Auster passed away. For a long time he was one of my favorite literary authors. I read all of his novels with the exception of the latest, Baumgartner, and most of his autobiographical works, and I want to take a moment to memorize him in my own way. I started reading his novels back in 2002 after a recommendation by a friend. Like many other people, my first Paul Auster read was the York Trilogy, and I was instantly a fan. Immediately, I bought 8 of his novels at the end of that year, and he became an automatic author for me. So I bought every new novel in the paperback edition, with the exception of a few hardbacks. Altogether, I read 23 of his works, and today I leafed through them once more. Of all those reads, I wrote only 7 reading experiences, some of which are very short. In memory of this great author, I will briefly show you my collection of his works. Many of these I've read too long ago to say anything noteworthy about them. I will only elaborate on the titles I wrote a review about, and I'll show them to you in random order. Starting with the York Trilogy, Mr. Vertigo, the Brooklyn Follies. I mentioned this book in my New York book tag video. I read this book in January of 2007. One of the most impressive parts is the story about the writer Franz Kafka. One day, it's just a few months before his passing, he meets a little girl on the street. She's crying because she's lost her doll. Kafka wants to comfort her and tells her that the doll is traveling. When the girl asks him how he knows this, he says, "She wrote me a letter." This is the beginning of a series of letters from the doll to the girl. Every day for 3 weeks, Kafka writes a letter to the girl who clings to it. Ultimately, Kafka has to close this situation, and he decides that the doll has gotten married. She is starting a new life and can therefore no longer be with the girl. The girl no longer misses the doll. Kafka has given her something else instead. She had the story, and when a person is lucky enough to live inside a story, to live inside an imaginary world, the pains of this world disappear. For as long as the story goes, reality no longer exists. There is another nice moment which shows how one of the characters, the little girl Lucy, takes words literally. At school, they each day get a packet of milk. "Go get your milk," the teacher says to the children. Every time, Lucy stays at the back and waits until everyone has taken milk. She didn't know which of the packages was hers, so she let the other children get their milk first, thinking that they apparently knew which package was theirs. The package that was thus left had to be her package. I love that. Timbuktu. Augi Wren's Christmas Story. Invisible. This novel, which I read in July of 2010, is less surreal than the average Auster, and it has more symbolism. Still, it is of the same high caliber as Man in the Dark or Brooklyn Follies, just to name a few. The story is about a student, Adam Walker, who comes into contact with a certain Rudolph Born. This meeting, and one event in particular, changes Walker's life drastically. The story takes typical Auster twists, and because each chapter is written from a different point of view, it is highly entertaining. The ending of the novel came rather abruptly for me and also left me somewhat disappointed. No apotheosis or thunderclap, but a rather unsatisfactory meeting between 2 characters from the book, which ends in the flight of one of them. Still, Invisible is a very good book, which rightly bears the name of this formidable author. Oracle Night. This is the only play by Auster I read. It's called The Inner Life of Martin Frost. Sunset Park. Imagine that you're 16 years old, while walking along the street with Bobby, the son of your father's second wife, you get into an argument with him. At one moment, you push him. He falls on the street and is immediately run over by a car. Try to imagine what that does to your life. This is the gist of Sunset Park. This event largely determines Miles Heller's life. The novel is structured around the various characters who move around Miles Heller. 5 years after this traumatic incident, he overhears his father, Morris, talking to his second wife, Willa, about him. His father says kind things about him, but Willa is less forthcoming. There's an anger and a coldness in him that frightens me. Miles, who is almost 21 years old at this point in time, feels as if he's being chopped into pieces. They had no idea how much he loved them. For 5 years, he had been walking around with the memory of what he had done to his brother on that road. And because he had never told his parents about the shove and how deeply he was tormented by it, they misread the guilt that had spread through his system as a form of sickness. He hated himself for having caused them so much sorrow, so much unnecessary grief. He realizes that he no longer dares to face them. Perhaps the best thing for all concerned would be to remove himself from their lives, to disappear. At the time of the story, Miles and his father have not been in contact for about 8 years. All this time he has kept himself alive by doing all kinds of odd jobs, which doesn't do justice to his good set of brains. He lives in Florida with his underage girlfriend, Pilar. One of her sisters blackmails him and threatens to report him for having sex with a minor. He has to flee until Pilar turns 18 in a few months and finds shelter in a squatter house of an old friend of his in Sunset Park in good old New York. Auster paints a striking portrait of all the residents of the house in Sunset Park in the effective way only he knows how to put on paper. In a few sentences, you understand how someone's psyche works and how the mutual relationships work. At some point, Miles reunites with his parents and even reveals his secret about the true circumstances of Bobby's death. In the final pages, Miles doesn't escape the fate he carries within him since his fatal push of Bobby, who was a brother and not a brother, both a son and not a son, both a friend and a foe. Again, Paul Auster commands great respect from me, and he has done so many times before. Everything fits and every piece of information relates to all the other building blocks that make up this beautiful work. The stories about baseball players and their prematurely ended careers, or the story of the soldier who miraculously managed to survive all lines of fire, strongly illustrate the contrast between bad luck and good fortune. The book is chock full of beautiful, symbolic anecdotes. The only downside I find in Auster's writing is his habit of making endless lists of things. But apart from this one dissonance, I have nothing but good things to say about this book. I am, and will remain, an Auster fan. In the Country of Last Things. The Red Notebook. Winter Journal. I attended a gathering where Paul Auster was present to promote his book Winter Journal. What a wonderful autobiographical work this is. Not only is the language beautiful, the narration is full of symbolism and wisdom, and it is written so compellingly that it is as if you are there with every event. It feels as if the reader switches places with the author's consciousness. There are very few writers who can do this in the impressive way Auster can. Everything is written in second person. By addressing the main character of the book as you, Auster protects himself from becoming too sentimental, and he can reflect honestly on what this see-through in time presents him with. In a sense, it is about someone else. This way, Auster examines his life. His body acts as the travel guide, for instance by describing all the wounds his body suffered from an early age until a serious car accident when he was 55 years old. Two examples of his artistry. the inventory of your scars, in particular the ones on your face. You understand that the assorted jagged lines etched into your skin of your face are letters from the secret alphabet that tells the story of who you are, for each scar is the trace of a healed wound, and each wound was caused by an unexpected collision with the world. No doubt you are a flawed and wounded person, a man who has carried a wound in him from the very beginning. Why else would you have spent the whole of your adult life bleeding words onto a page? Auster describes, among other things, the 21 addresses where he lived during his life. He talks candidly about his burgeoning sexuality and the obsessive role it played during his early adolescent life. He describes his ditto ego in those years as a willing slave of eros. On most days you could think of little else, on some days of nothing else. He movingly describes his relationship with his mother and her sudden death, and recounts his meeting with the woman to whom he had been married for about 30 years, Siri Hustvedt. Intelligence is the one human quality that cannot be faked, and once your eyes had adjusted to the dazzle of her beauty, you understood that this was a brilliant woman, one of the best minds you had ever met. For all these years you have been living inside the long, uninterrupted conversation that started the day you met. The book covers just about all human emotions, from sadness, pain and fear, to love, beauty and humour. The only regrettable thing, again, is Auster's tendency to sum up various lists, something he also does in his novels. Naming all the 21 addresses, for instance, was really pushing it, but he also loses himself occasionally in entire pages of listing this or that. No matter how resourceful and diverse they may be, they're boring. Leviathan. The Invention of Solitude. Report from the Interior. After his beautiful winter journal, my expectations were high, but unfortunately this book doesn't live up to it. At the start, the author explains what he had in mind when writing this book. It was one thing to write about your body, to catalogue the manifold knocks and pleasures experienced by your physical self, but exploring your mind as you remember it from childhood will no doubt be a more difficult task, perhaps an impossible one. Still, you feel compelled to give it a try. Indeed, it turns out to be an impossible task. This doesn't necessarily make it a bad book. I do not believe that Auster is capable of writing a bad book. He is simply too great an artist for that. But to be honest, the first 100 pages contain all the highlights. He writes beautiful things, and his Recherche de temps perdu stimulated my own memory machine. Many of his memories also brought back a flood of memories and associations for me. Very beautiful, for example, is the moment he describes when, as a 6-year-old boy, on a random day he is suddenly overwhelmed by a feeling of happiness. What had happened to cause such an overpowering feeling? Impossible to know, but you suspect it had something to do with the birth of self-consciousness. That thing that happens to children at around the age of 6, when the inner voice awakens and the ability to think a thought and tell yourself you are thinking that thought begins. Until that morning, you just were. Now, you knew that you were. The remaining 240 pages are below average. Auster spends almost 70 pages describing 2 movies, and he quotes extensively from letters he wrote to his first wife between 1966 and 1969. On the one hand, these letters provide a nice insight into his struggles as a young writer and his melancholy moods, but they're not very well written. It left me with the feeling that Auster cheated me with 2 easily filled pages. The Music of Chance. The Book of Illusions. Here and Now. From this collection I particularly enjoyed Paul Auster's letters. I find Coetzee's style a bit stiff and difficult to follow in places. Auster observes from his nature, which gives his prose a flow that is pleasant to read while still telling us something. Coetzee puts a philosophical, almost scientific membrane over everything. His formulation is very formal and quite literary, by which I mean needlessly cumbersome. He also makes universal laws very quickly based on his private experiences. Still, some of the pearls of prose in this book are from the hand of Coetzee. Both writers reflect in their letters on topics such as friendship, the shameful pleasure of watching sports on TV, literary criticism, and of course, writing. This collection offers a disarmingly candid insight into the lives of both writers during the years 2008 to 2011. I very much enjoyed this book. Moon Palace. His biggest book, 4321. This novel, unfortunately, was my greatest disappointment in all of Auster's work. It is his only book I DNF'd. Hand to Mouth. Travels in the Scriptorum. Man in the Dark. This book is a masterpiece. The surreal element is present in good doses, and the whole thing definitely makes you think about the possible meaning of our earthly ordeal. And of course, there are beautiful sentences. The main character, August Brill, invents stories to get through the sleepless night in an attempt to keep painful memories from creeping into his consciousness. The main story he comes up with is quite absurd and surreal. The United States, after all, ended up in a civil war, with the various states fighting for independence. At the end of the story, Owen Brick, the main character in his story, is unwittingly ordered to kill the creator of this story in which he features. He must do this to prevent more civilian casualties in the war. Halfway through the book, it seems as if Brill is staging his own murder. This is a suicide of sorts, based on one of his stories he creates. But in reality, this never takes place. In the end, we learn that Brill's granddaughter, Katja, whose husband has died during a war, also suffers from insomnia. After all, he finally tells her the memories he so desperately tried to avoid, only to discover that there is also a lot of beauty in them. One quote: "Escaping into a film is not like escaping into a book. Books force you to give something back to them, to exercise your intelligence and imagination, whereas you can watch a film and even enjoy it in a state of mindless passivity." These last years I grew out of touch with Paul Auster's work. My disappointment about his big novel 4321 is partly responsible for that. Also, he published a lot of non-fiction that wasn't autobiographical and didn't really interest me that much. Perhaps that is why I didn't immediately buy his last novel, Baumgartner, which was published in November of 2023. Despite the fact that some of his work didn't appeal to me that much, I would say that 80% of what I've read by this author is outstandingly good. Auster has such a unique voice, and also his surrealism is one of a kind. It is sad to know that we won't be welcoming any new works by him, unless of course there's lots of unpublished material. I'll be on the lookout for any posthumous releases by this great writer. At the end of my review of Man in the Dark, I tried to characterize Paul Auster as a writer. He was a pessimist, but at least he wore that smile of wisdom on his face. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until we meet again at Dutch Greybeard.